Since Memories Off the Starry Sky is a slice-of-life visual novel just released from the renowned Memories Off series, a series with countless well-received titles that has never been translated into English. Until now. Today, we will look not only if it lives up to the hype of the Memories Off name, but if Off the Starry Sky is just a good visual novel in general. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is BruceGoneLoose, but you can just call me Bruce, as we explore the first translated entry in this supposed legendary series. And thank you to PQube for giving me a review key. Junya Mizumoto is a college student who works at his family's general store, Suigendo, in the town of Sumisora. A year prior, his brother, Takia, died in a tragic accident while driving for a job with Junya, and this is something to this day Junya has not gotten over. His childhood friends Chihaya and Hinata do their best to support him, but his brother's accident is something he can't forget, especially because Junya constantly compares himself to Takia. One day, whilst taking a personal request from Chihaya about renovating her grandfather's manor, a young girl named Azusa visits Suigendo and yells at Junya, saying that he should have been the one to die in the accident. From there, depending on your choices, the situation slowly evolves as Junya must learn to deal with his feelings. Let me give you a rundown on the characters real quick, because they're uncommon combinations of common tropes. Chihaya Hojo, Junya's first childhood friend, is the Ojo-sama local to Sumisora who is engaged to a man named Shigeto, arranged by her father with the purpose of continuing the Hojo legacy. She's a bit airheaded and very reliant on Junya and her friends, sometimes to her detriment. She goes to university with Junya and Hinata, and will have to be married when she graduates. Hinata Issei is Junya's second childhood best friend and servant to Chihaya, and while certainly more friend than servant-like, she takes her job very seriously, as it is the Issei family duty to serve the Hojos. She is very serious and often scolds Junya for his lack of self-awareness. But on the flip side, she's actually a giant otaku. Also, she has enormous tits. Azusa Satomi is a girl Junya meets suddenly one night who blames him for his brother Takiya's death. While she is quite the lolly-esque tsundere, she nonetheless sticks with Junya to observe him, and every now and then she has a cute side to her which amuses Junya and his friends. Yuriko Oyama is a girl who isn't in the story for any reason besides ruining the following girl's route. Yes, I am mad, and no, I'm not sorry for it. But to be slightly less biased, Yuriko is an idol on hiatus, returning to Junya's town to revisit old memories. Chunyu is a Chinese transfer student who is very interested in Japanese culture. She is also an Ojo-sama, but is very business-orientated and blunt, oftentimes disregarding others' feelings. Chunyu is by far my favorite heroine in this visual novel, and we'll talk about that a little more later. Besides our main heroines, Junya has quite a few people around him, like Misora, his Gyaru sister, and her half-finished friend Aino, who is not so secretly in love with Junya. But yeah, no route for her. Put her in the robbed heroine group. Also, Beat. There are plenty more characters in this visual novel as you advance the plot in certain directions and explore the different areas of Sumisora. While I like the initial concept of the heroines' personalities, within the first chapter you can begin to understand how frustrating Junya's character is. At any chance where it could even be possibly relevant, Junya laments Takiya's death, compares himself to Takia, and wishes he could have died instead. I obviously get the grief and PTSD part, but it had to have been mentioned at least 100 times in the story, and more likely 100 times around. There is a dream sequence at the beginning of the visual novel where you experience this accident firsthand, which I thought was a good setup to the story. And then I saw it 3 times a chapter and began to get annoyed. Furthermore, the man is dense. The only thing more dense than Junya is osmium, and it's a close race. Obviously, most anime and visual novel protagonists are dense to an extent, but it makes reading this visual novel frustrating. If you don't like the anime girl hints at liking a guy, goes over guy's head, other anime girl scolds guy for being dense, guy still doesn't get it formula, you're gonna try and unalive yourself by the end of chapter 3 in this visual novel. The common route is relatively normal and introduces you to all the characters. Honestly, because since Memories Off the Starry Sky is a slice-of-life visual novel, nothing interesting really happens until you start diving into the heroine's routes. The routes branch off pretty early in the story, so this isn't a pressing issue, though even with the early branching point, the pacing can drag on sometimes. One thing I want to emphasize before I dive into talking about the routes is that romance is not a core focus of this visual novel, but rather the circumstances around each heroine and how Junya goes about helping them. That being said, most of the heroine routes end with Junya getting into a relationship with the respective heroine, but I'd argue only 2 of them actually have good romantic development. So with that said, let's talk about the routes. The route structure of this visual novel is weird, and to emphasize that, I drew a lovely picture. It follows a binary tree format, meaning at multiple points there will be a decision point where Junya must choose to help or agree with one of 2 heroines, which determines whose route you'll eventually get to proceed down. Most heroines only have normal and best ends, with the best end usually just changing the final scene, with the difference usually being whether Junya and the heroine's romance actually blooms. The choices before the end of chapter 3 do not matter, but that shouldn't exactly discourage you from actively thinking about them, because some of them can bring about amusing results. For the choices that do matter, it's usually pretty obvious which will lead to the bad, normal, or best ends, so you probably won't need any sort of guide to read this one. So with that in mind, let's get to the routes in the order that I read them in. I'll of course be avoiding spoilers and only talk about them in a general manner. Hinata's route is funky in that she's the only heroine who has bad ends directly in her route, and there are 2 to boot. This isn't exactly a problem for me because I can enjoy a good bad ending, but it makes me wonder why she was the only one given bad ends. This route is also the most unique as it doesn't share similarities with other routes. Hinata's personality really shines in her route, but not exactly in the best of ways. Whilst you definitely see her good side through her otaku and homely traits, she is also extremely stubborn and downright rude to Junya and others at various points. This isn't even tsundere, it's just soon, and sooner or later it gets kind of annoying. This is a route I'd classify as interesting and decent, but nothing exactly special that I haven't seen done better in other visual novels I've read. That being said, I was a little surprised to see how it turned out given the general tone of the first couple of chapters. Chihaya's and Azusa's routes have the latest branching point in our binary tree of decisions, so the routes share a lot of similarities, with Chihaya's having more of a romantic development to it and Azusa's tying up all loose ends. They both involve searching for the Starry Sky room Azusa remembers. With their own subplots depending on who Junya focuses on. Chihaya's route has one of the better romance developments in Off the Starry Sky, but only because of the pre-imposed childhood friendship dynamic, which I'm not exactly a fan of. As previously mentioned, as an Ojo-sama, she is engaged to a man named Shigeto at her father's behest. I can't really say any more, but whatever you think in regards to these details about the progression of her route, you're probably right. Azusa's route shares a lot of details with Chihaya's route, so whichever of these routes you read first, you may get frustrated by the slow progression of the other. That being said, you should read Chihaya's route first, because Azusa's route is the closest to what I'd call the true ending, even if I wouldn't say it's my favorite route. These routes are pivotal behind Junya's discovery of what happened in his accident with his brother Takia, and give the most closure to all the mysteries built up during the story. I read these routes second and third, but if I could reread Off the Starry Sky for the first time again, I'd probably read them last. Up until this point, I would say my experience of reading Off the Starry Sky was satisfying, and I'd put it between good and great, despite many of the annoyances that I have had. But I'm BruceGoneLoose, not Bruce gets cucked by a fucking idol. So with that in mind, let's start talking about Chunyu's route. Chunyu's route is pretty much hijacked by Yuriko, mostly being focused around helping Yuriko get her spirits back up so she'll continue her musical activities. This was annoying. Admittedly, I can see why they went this direction. Whilst Chunyu is often in scenes in other routes, Yuriko's presence is non-existent until this point, showing up maybe 2 or 3 times in the entire left half of that tree I drew. But this is at the detriment to her own route. Don't get me wrong, this route has some great moments with Chunyu's quirks, and some of my favorite scenes in the entire visual novel, but it's just disappointing that the narrative got distracted from Chunyu due to Yuriko. Lastly, it has one of the least satisfying best ends in the entirety of Off the Starry Sky, so in conclusion, Chunyu got robbed. Now let's talk about the robber baron. Yuriko's route is the worst route with the best romantic development in the game. Go figure. Its progression felt very similar to other visual novels with idol heroines I've read, and to be honest, it wasn't anything special. However, it had the most scenes that actually felt like a romance was building between Chunyu and Yuriko in a natural way. That said, one issue I had, which I didn't have in other routes, is that the choices weren't obvious at all. I had to skip through the route like 8 times over the course of an hour trying to figure out the correct sequence of choices. And I didn't record them, so I can't help you. For my ranking of the routes from worst to best, it'd be Chunyu, Yuriko, Hinata, Azusa, then Chihaya at the top. All the routes branching from choosing Chihaya at the first decision point are clearly the story Since Memories off the Starry Sky wanted to tell, whereas the other 2 routes feel extremely tacked on. Even despite my grievances about Chunyu's route, it's really not that bad, but we all know how disappointing it is to have a favorite heroine right off the bat, only for her route to be lacking. From here, we'll move on to some of the general thoughts and concerns I had for the story as a whole, and then wrap up by discussing some of the best parts of Off the Starry Sky. The pacing of this visual novel is not ideal, and this is besides Junior's brother complex, density, and the jokes made at his lack of self-awareness. A lot of the time, characters stand around talking for too long about doing something and just not actually doing it. The same plot points get repeated over and over, and sometimes the same drama is repeated, delaying the plot and looping this cycle. It can be frustrating, and I found myself speed reading through a lot of these parts because of it. The world building is pretty stellar. By the end of Off the Starry Sky, you feel well acquainted with Sumisora and Junia's life and inner circle of friends and family, and it made me feel a tinge of regret for it to have ended. This is where a lot of the side characters shine, and most of them are persistent in every route, giving Sumisora a sense of being a close community. Chunyu works for his family's business whilst going to university, which is a nice change of pace to the normal high school scenarios we often see in slice of life and moage visual novels. The story doesn't focus too much on his university experience either, often just being a place to meet with his friends, whilst he otherwise works his various handyman jobs. The visual novel closest to how this feels is Tomio After Story, but not in its bad ways. Now let's wrap up this video with the best of what Off the Starry Sky has to offer. Everything not involving the writing. The sprites, backgrounds, and CGs are all incredible, and I'm sure you could tell by just looking at them. One thing I'll mention is that characters don't have a lot of sprite poses, but they do have moving mouths, and there are plenty of CGs to make up for the lack of unique sprites. Also, feet. An interesting tidbit about this visual novel is that all of the non-heroine designs are pretty unique, whereas all of the heroine designs are identical, and I didn't find this exactly ideal. I'm not asking for every heroine to have some bright colored hair, but at least add some highlights or accessories. Geez. Also a bit late to mention this, but this visual novel doesn't have H scenes, so don't read it for that. Most of the voice actors have not done many visual novels prior to Off the Starry Sky, but despite that, I found the voice acting top notch. I only knew 2 of the side character VAs, who had played the protagonist in one of my favorite anime ever, and an annoying magical girl bunny thing in the worst visual novel I've ever read. But every role is done well, and I hope to hear these VAs more in the future. Abo Takeshi. Need I say any more? Most of the tracks slap in his usual style, so unsurprisingly, the soundtrack is one of the best parts in this visual novel. The engine was flawless for 99% of my playthrough. Some soundtracks randomly stopped only during Azusa's route, but would start right back up again as soon as I reloaded. Skip is fast enough to not be annoying, and you have all the options you really typically need. So overall, an A. I had no real issues with the translation. At some points, tsundere is translated as, if I remember correctly, spicy with a bit of sweet, or something to that matter, and lolicon was translated to the P word, albeit that line is cut off so it's not the entire word. I know these things can piss people off, so I thought I'd mention them, but besides the 3 occurrences of these translations, I found the rest to be fine. There were a couple contextual mix-ups from what the Japanese was implying from my minor knowledge of Japanese, but I remember only counting a few occurrences, and there are very few grammar and spelling errors. I can come off very negatively when discussing certain visual novels, but it's not always because they are bad. In this case, it's because there are a lot of good elements to Off the Starry Sky that could have really given a slightly different direction to the writing and story beats. I like Since Memories Off the Starry Sky, and I'd give it my recommendation if you were looking for a slice of life visual novel, but it's not perfect by any means, and I wouldn't move it up your backlog if you got some more renowned titles to read first. The Memories Off series, especially the earlier titles, have really great reviews. I hope to read those VNs in the future, but from reading countless reviews of the entire Memories Off series, Since Memories Off the Starry Sky, despite being the most recent title in the series, doesn't compare, especially when you consider it's not a main series Memories Off game. But that doesn't mean you have to dislike it. I personally feel it stands on its own as an enjoyable, if slightly flawed, slice of life title, and I'll leave it up to you to decide whether the issues I talked about in this video make or break whether you buy this game. This is my longest review in quite a while, so thanks for watching, as well as, again, thanks for PQube for giving me this review key. I've got 15 videos now in like my half-edited backlog, so hopefully I'll get more stuff out soon, and yeah, see you later.